Good morning, everyone. I will stand on existing protocol, but I'll say thank you to the University of South Africa for the invitation. Distinguished colleagues, honored guests, and fellow scholars, it is my privilege to address you today on the topic that I selected for my intervention today, and that is African-centered approaches to governance in the context of global technological shifts. I think that this topic addresses a question that sits at the intersection of law, of technology, and history and justice. And that question is, what does it mean to govern technology from an African-centered perspective, especially in a rapidly shifting global order? I think that this question is not just a legal question. It's also not just a technical question. I think it's a question about power. It's a question about whose voice is heard. It's a question about whose voice is silenced, and also about the distribution of benefits in a world that is increasingly shaped by data, by algorithms, and also by artificial intelligence. To understand our present moment, we have to situate it within a longer arc of technological change. So we started with the printing press. Prior to the printing press, we had people deliver or disseminate information from one person to another, right? And then when the printing press came, it enabled knowledge dissemination to happen quicker and a lot more seamlessly than what we were doing with person-to-person knowledge dissemination. And that led to the early copyright regime, where we then started protecting the works of authors of given work from being reproduced and copied without their authorization, because in that space, they would lose revenue that would have accrued to them if they were able to, they were able to be in charge of reproducing their works. We moved then from the printing press to the Industrial Revolution that prompted labor laws and regulatory institutions. And what we see is that each technological shift will require or has required new governance regimes, or at least a different governance regime. So there's that response of law and governance and regulatory framework to changes or disruptions or technological shifts. Then we came with the digital revolution, where you then find, before then you had, in the 20th century, we had broadcasting and telecommunications coming up that also led to regulatory frameworks around spectrum, around public broadcasting, and also around intellectual property as a response to those technological changes. In Africa, where we have a lot of history with previous colonial masters, there's also a response from the governance frameworks to deal with broadcasting in that space. So you will find that across many African countries, you will find that the broadcasting regulation would require the public service broadcaster to ensure that it has content in local language. And that's in response to addressing the fact that many African countries, if not all, that were colonized, had to use the language of the colonial masters for communication. But you would then find that because of those broadcasting regulations that required local content in national languages, you then have a lot of data that is now relevant for the artificial intelligence environment that we exist in. So there's a lot of linguistic and cultural data that we find with national public service broadcasters. Then we have the digital revolution, so the internet, big data, and AI. But unlike earlier technologies, you find that AI does not merely extend human capacity or human capability. It also learns from human-generated data. So it absorbs language, it absorbs culture and knowledge, often without regard to the origin or to the source of that language or culture or knowledge, often without regard to ownership, often without regard to context. And that's where we find the shift, that data has become the raw material for global power. The global governance responses to this shift have largely been shaped by what we might call universalist legal frameworks, where we are coming up with laws that seek to address everyone as if we stand on the same footing, as if we stand on the same context. And one example that we find is with open licenses. So in the copyright environment, you require a license to use copyright protected material when it aligns with the exclusive rights that copyright gives to the copyright owner. Then we started seeing the advent of open licenses where you didn't now need to ask for permission from the copyright owner because they would have given permission prior in the first place. And they give those permissions without requiring you to pay for those licenses. So you have Creative Commons licenses, you have various software licenses that are open licenses, where licensed materials can be used without asking for permission, without needing to pay for those things. But one of the things that you will notice with the open licenses is that universalist framework that I spoke about, where you grant people access regardless of their context. So it doesn't matter if you are a visually impaired person, it doesn't matter if you have access to data or to the internet to be able to access those materials. It just assumes that you have access and you can sort yourself out. I think the keynote speaker in the earlier session, Justice Mulema, mentioned the assumptions about openness, where we take the view that openness democratizes access and everyone can enjoy this new thing that we are providing access for them to. But the truth of the matter is that, yes, openness does give that access to everyone, but it assumes a level playing field that actually does not exist. It treats all users as equal participants in the global data economy, despite vast differences in infrastructure, in capacity, in historical positioning. And the result is that we have formal equality that produces substantive inequity, even if it doesn't produce inequality. African data sets that are often painstakingly curated under resource constraints become freely available to actors with vastly greater computational and financial power. Think about this for a moment. In the era of artificial intelligence, you find that you need access to data centers where these data is trained and then used to develop AI systems. In the whole of Africa, last I checked, there's only one data center, and it's that in South Africa. What that then means is that when you use these open licenses to grant, give it to me so that I will know, is it 10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Okay, so, but what then happens is you create data sets that can be used to train artificial intelligence systems. And you use an open license to grant access to everyone. Someone in the EU or someone in the US where there are hundreds of data centers would quickly be able to access a data center and use that data to train their AI systems. Someone in Africa has to do what? So even though you have these openly licensed data sets, you find that we are not able to actually use it the same way. And so that then brings me to the point that the Constitutional Court of South Africa made in the blind essay case, where the court said that in trying to enforce the right to equality, we have to sometimes treat different people differently so that we can achieve equitable outcomes. I will give my favorite example. If I have 10 million rands, that's a good amount of money, right? If I have 10 million rands, and I say that these 10 million rands I will give to either Prof. Manamela or I'll give to Advocate Ford to buy a house in Stanton. Nice? Yes. And then I say, whoever gets to Stanton first collects the 10 million rands. But Prof. Manamela doesn't have a car. But Advocate Ford has a car. Who's going to get there first? But I gave them equal opportunity to have access to 10 million rands. This amount of money is plenty. Okay, so what that then tells us is that the law and the governance frameworks, if you look at licensing as a governance framework, which it is, plays a dual role, where on one hand, you have openness, you have access, but on the other hand, you could be enabling inequities, you could be enabling exclusion, because you are treating differently situated people the same. So you are achieving equality, but you are missing out on equity, which is even more important. And so you have ethical tensions, you have that lack of context, where justice is, there's that pursuit of justice without context, without nuance. And so what does it then mean to adopt an African-centered approach to governance? What will it look like? I think that it begins with rejecting the assumption that global frameworks are neutral. It begins with the assumption of rejection of the assumption that global frameworks are universally applicable. Instead, we should insist on context, we should insist on community, we should insist on equity. And I'll quickly highlight these principles. Contextual governance recognizes that legal frameworks must reflect local realities. One of the work that we've done at Data Science Law Lab, and which I led, is to develop a different kind of open license for sharing African data sets. That license is in short form the NUDU license. And what we've done with that license is to create a tiered licensing model where you differentiate people's access to data sets based on the kind of infrastructure that they have access to. So people from developing countries, which is where Africa falls into, get to use those data sets for free without any barriers, without any restrictions. But if you are from a developed country, you would be required to provide a benefit to the creators of that African data set. And that's a way that we felt makes sense to recognize the context that we stand on as people from this continent. So it moves from a one-size-fits-all approach, to an approach that recognizes context. The second thing is community agency and ownership. African approaches must emphasize that data is not just a resource, it is a social and a cultural asset. So governance must therefore recognize community ownership, ensure meaningful participation in decision-making, and protect against exploitative uses. Grassroots AI initiatives across Africa already embody this ethos, leveraging collective knowledge and participatory methodologies to build inclusive technologies. The third thing is benefit sharing and reciprocity. African-centered governance must insist on reciprocity. If data is flowing globally, the benefits also has to flow back. And so that includes economic returns, it includes capacity building, infrastructure development, recognition of contributions. Because without such mechanisms, openness risks perpetuating inequality rather than alleviating it. How do we reimagine global governance, especially from an African-centered perspective? African-centered approaches are not inward-looking. They are not about isolation. They are not about exceptionalism. They offer a corrective lens for global governance. So by foregrounding equity, context, and community, they challenge dominant paradigms and enrich global debates. So the lesson emerging from Africa on participatory governance, on ethical AI, on equitable data practices have relevance far beyond the continent. And so we stand at a pivotal moment. The governance framework we design today will shape the future of technology, but the distribution of power and opportunity for generations to come. If we continue to rely on universalist model like I've described, just with open licenses, universalist model that ignore context, we risk reproducing historical patterns of extraction and inequality, this time in digital form, and that's really going to be bad because the internet never forgets. But if we embrace African-centered approaches that are grounded in justice, in ethics, in lived realities, we have the opportunity to build a more inclusive and equitable technological future. So let's move from just openness to equitable openness. Let's move from just access to also agency. Let's move from innovation to inclusive innovation. We have to move from global governance to genuinely plural governance that recognizes different people differently and where they are. Because in doing so, we will not just be responding to technological changes and shifts, we will be shaping them. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Okorie. You're also very economical on time. Thank you so much. Prof, I just want to highlight something that you said at the beginning. You asked the question and said, what does it mean to govern technology in the African perspective? And then you said that it actually includes 4 things, which is power, whose voice is heard, whose voice is silenced, and distribution.